Jake couldn't pinpoint exactly when things started feeling off. It wasn't one moment but a series of small, subtle changes. Olivia had always been warm, her laughter filling the quiet corners of their shared apartment. But lately, her smiles seemed forced, her laughter hollow, as though she was going through the motions of a role she no longer believed in. It was the little things that first caught Jake's attention. Olivia had started staying out later than usual, brushing off his questions with vague excuses about work or last-minute plans with friends. She had never been the type to cling to her phone, but now it seemed glued to her hand. She texted constantly, her fingers moving with a quiet urgency, and she always tilted the screen away when Jake walked by. When he asked her about it, she waved it off with a dismissive laugh, telling him he was being paranoid. Jake tried to convince himself he was overthinking. After all, wasn't he supposed to trust her? That's what relationships were built on, wasn't it? But no matter how much he tried to push the thoughts aside, the doubts crept in like shadows, dark and insistent. He started noticing patterns, the late nights, the muted phone calls, the sudden need for space. She wasn't the same Olivia he'd fallen in love with, and it gnawed at him. One evening, Jake came home earlier than expected. Olivia wasn't there, but her coat and bag were still by the door. He found her sitting on the couch, staring at her phone, her expression unusually serious. She didn't notice him at first, and for a brief moment, he considered pretending he hadn't seen her like this. But something inside him urged him to speak. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but probing. "Everything okay?" Olivia jumped, quickly locking her phone and shoving it into the cushion beside her. "Yeah, just texting Ashley about work stuff." Her response was too quick, too rehearsed, and Jake felt a pang of something cold settle in his chest. He wanted to press her, to ask what was really going on, but he hesitated. Instead, he forced a smile and nodded. For the next week, Jake observed quietly, gathering bits and pieces of her odd behavior. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew there was something she wasn't telling him. The distance between them grew, an invisible chasm neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Then, one night, Olivia asked if they could talk. Her tone was serious, almost grave, and Jake felt his stomach twist. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "I need to tell you something," Olivia began, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together on the table. "And I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Jake nodded, his throat tight. She took a deep breath, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "A few weeks ago I made a mistake. I went out with some friends, and I drank too much. I wasn't thinking clearly and—" She paused, her voice breaking. "I kissed someone. And it didn't stop there." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Jake felt his chest tighten, his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mind raced, a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disbelief, but outwardly, he remained composed. Olivia watched him, her eyes wide and searching, as though bracing herself for an explosion. But Jake didn't yell. He didn't cry. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and let out a slow, measured breath. "Well," he said finally, his tone steady. "Funny you should say that." Olivia frowned, her expression shifting from guilt to confusion. "What do you mean?" Jake met her gaze, his face unreadable. "I've been seeing someone else too," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "The entire time we've been together." The color drained from Olivia's face. For a moment, she looked as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Then her eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her voice rising in pitch. "What are you talking about?" "Who?" Jake shrugged, his expression cool and detached. "Someone you wouldn't know. She's always been around, though. I just never mentioned her." Olivia's mouth opened and closed, her words stumbling over each other. "You're joking, right? You're trying to get back at me or something?" Jake's lips curled into a faint smile, but he said nothing. Panic flickered across Olivia's face, her voice growing more frantic. Jake, I told you the truth because I wanted to fix this. It was a mistake, a stupid, drunken mistake. But you're saying you've been seeing someone else this whole time? Who is she? I need to know. Jake stood up, his movements deliberate and calm. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice firm. What matters is that I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she pleaded with him. Jake, please. It was one mistake. I was drunk. I didn't mean for it to happen. We can fix this. But Jake shook his head, cutting her off. I don't want to fix it, Olivia. Pack your things. He turned and walked away, leaving Olivia sitting at the table, her face pale and her eyes brimming with tears. As he closed the door to their bedroom behind him, Jake felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't the reaction he'd expected from himself, but it felt right. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest had lifted. Something inside him whispered that this was just the beginning, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Olivia sat frozen at the table, her mind reeling. Jake's words echoed in her ears, loud and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. I've been seeing someone else too. It didn't make sense. Jake had always been steady, reliable, the kind of man who gave his entire heart to the people he cared about. The thought of him betraying her, of him holding back something so monumental, didn't fit the image she had built of him. And yet, the calm certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. Jake! She called after him, her voice cracking. She got up and followed him into the bedroom, her steps hurried, her breath shallow. He was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out into the night as if she weren't even there. Jake, you can't just drop something like that and walk away, she said, her tone pleading now. Who is she? Is it someone I know? Jake turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Why does it matter, Olivia? Does knowing her name change anything? Yes, Olivia exclaimed, her voice trembling. It matters because this doesn't make sense. You're not like that. You wouldn't. She stopped herself, her mind stumbling over the contradiction. You've been lying to me this whole time? Jake tilted his head, considering her words. Funny how that works, isn't it? He said, his tone measured, almost detached. You lied to me too, didn't you? When you came home that night, when you acted like everything was fine? And now you want the truth? Maybe I wanted the truth too. His words hit her like a slap. She had expected anger, shouting, maybe even tears. But this cold indifference, this calm unraveling of everything she thought she knew, was far worse. I told you because I felt guilty, Olivia said, her voice softening. I wanted to fix things, Jake. I made a mistake, but I didn't mean to hurt you. You're saying you've been cheating on me this whole time? How could you do that? Jake let out a bitter laugh, the sound low and unfamiliar. How could I? That's rich coming from you. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. You cheated, Olivia. You broke this first. So don't stand there and act like you have the moral high ground. I was drunk, she shot back, desperation creeping into her tone. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a relationship. It was one night. But you're talking about something ongoing, something you've been hiding for years? That's not the same thing, Jake. Maybe it isn't, he replied coolly. Or maybe it is. The fact is, it doesn't matter now. We're done. The finality in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Olivia felt a wave of panic rising, threatening to pull her under. She couldn't lose him, not like this, not over a mistake. She reached for him, her hands trembling, but he stepped back, keeping the distance between them. Who is she, Jake? She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Please. Just tell me the truth. Jake hesitated, his gaze flickering for a moment. Then he let out a sigh, as if resigned to the game he was playing. You really want to know? He asked, his tone laced with challenge. Yes, she said quickly, nodding. It's Emily, he said. Olivia's brows furrowed. Emily? Jake nodded, his expression calm, almost smug. She's been around for years. Always nearby. I never brought her up because, well, why would I? You wouldn't have wanted to hear about her. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The name felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. I don't understand. Where did you meet her? At work, Jake replied simply. She's in HR. Always helpful, always understanding. Someone I could talk to. The calmness in his voice made Olivia's stomach churn. She tried to picture this Emily, this woman who had apparently been a shadow in their relationship all along. Was she prettier than Olivia? Smarter? Did she laugh at Jake's jokes the way Olivia used to? The questions swirled in her mind, each one sharper and more painful than the last. Jake, please, she said, her voice breaking. You don't mean this. You're just trying to hurt me because of what I told you. I made a mistake, but we can get past it. We can fix this. Why would I want to fix it? Jake asked, his voice low and steady. You cheated, Olivia. You made your choice. And now I'm making mine. The words hung between them like a wall, impenetrable and final. Olivia felt tears streaming down her cheeks, her chest heaving with sobs she couldn't contain. She had thought confessing her mistake would bring them closer, that her honesty would pave the way for forgiveness. But instead, she had opened the door to a truth she wasn't prepared to face. Jake moved past her, heading toward the door. You should start packing, he said without looking back. I'll give you some time. Olivia stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him stay and talk this through. But she knew it was pointless. The Jake standing in front of her now wasn't the same man she had known. Or maybe he was, and she had never truly understood him. As the door closed behind him, Olivia sank to the floor, her sobs filling the empty room. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she clung to the hope that this wasn't the end, that Jake would change his mind, that they could still salvage what was left of their love. But another part of her, the part that had been watching this unravel for weeks, knew the truth. In the other room, Jake sat on the couch, his face unreadable. He stared at the blank TV screen, his mind replaying the conversation. The knot in his chest had loosened, but there was no sense of victory, no triumph. Only a quiet, simmering calm, as if a storm had passed and left him standing in its wake. The name Emily lingered in his mind, a name pulled from thin air, a figment of his imagination. There was no Emily. There never had been. But the look on Olivia's face, the way her certainty had crumbled, felt like justice in a way he couldn't explain. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let out a long breath. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt quiet again. Peaceful. But even as he sat there, Jake knew the night wasn't over, and the weight of everything that had just happened still lingered in the air. Olivia's departure was swift and silent. She didn't argue again, didn't try to convince Jake to change his mind. Instead, she moved through the apartment like a ghost, gathering her things with trembling hands. Jake stayed in the living room, deliberately distant, listening to the faint sounds of drawers opening and closing, of zippers being tugged and bags being packed. He didn't move to help her, didn't even glance toward the hallway. When she finally emerged, her eyes were red, her face pale. She stood by the door for a moment, her hand resting on the knob as if waiting for Jake to stop her. But he didn't. He didn't say a word. She opened the door, paused, then turned back to face him one last time. I loved you, she said, her voice barely audible, cracking under the weight of her grief. I hope you know that. Jake looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a fleeting moment, he thought about saying something, anything, that might ease the tension, soften the edges of what had just happened. But the words never came. He simply nodded, and Olivia, taking that as the only answer she was going to get, stepped out into the night. The door clicked shut behind her, and with it came a profound, echoing silence. Jake let out a long breath and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. He felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying had been lifted. Yet there was no satisfaction, no sense of triumph. What lingered instead was a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He sat there for a while, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around him like a blanket. Memories of Olivia flickered in his mind, the way she used to laugh uncontrollably at his terrible jokes, the way she'd curl up next to him during movie nights, the way she'd hum under her breath while cooking breakfast. Those moments felt distant now, like fragments of a life that no longer belonged to him. After some time, Jake pulled out his phone and opened the group chat with his friends. He typed a quick message, *barbecue tomorrow? My place, *. Within seconds the replies poured in. Hell yeah, man. About time we did something. You buying the beer or should I bring some? Jake smirked, a small spark of warmth cutting through the haze of his thoughts. He needed this, needed the noise, the laughter, the distraction. Tomorrow would be loud and chaotic, and for now, that was enough. The next afternoon, the smell of charcoal and sizzling meat filled the air as Jake stood by the grill, beer in hand. His friends had arrived in full force, bringing enough food and drinks to feed an army. The backyard was alive with conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet of the night before. One of his friends, Mark, clapped him on the shoulder. So, are we gonna talk about why you suddenly decided to host a barbecue, or are we just gonna keep eating your burgers? Jake chuckled, flipping a burger on the grill. Let's just say I had some free time open up. Mark raised an eyebrow, then smirked. Ah, got it. Relationship drama? Jake shrugged, his expression relaxed. Something like that. The others overheard and started chiming in, their voices a mix of teasing and genuine curiosity. Jake gave them a brief rundown, skipping the details but painting enough of a picture to satisfy their questions. By the end of it, the group was laughing and shaking their heads in disbelief. Man, Mark said, raising his beer in a mock toast. Here's to new beginnings. And to Jake finally having the guts to kick someone out instead of putting up with their nonsense. Jake laughed, clinking his bottle against Mark's. Cheers to that. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Jake found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months. The sound of his friends' laughter, the warm glow of the setting sun, the simplicity of being surrounded by people who cared, it all felt grounding, a reminder of the life he still had outside of the mess he just walked away from. But even amidst the laughter and easy conversation, Jake couldn't stop his mind from drifting back to the night before. He thought about Olivia's face as she had stood by the door, about the pain in her voice when she'd said she loved him. He wondered if she was sitting in some new apartment right now, unpacking her bags and replaying their breakup in her mind the way he was. The thought didn't bring him sadness or regret, but it did bring clarity. He had loved Olivia once. But love alone wasn't enough, not when trust had been shattered, not when resentment had started to creep in like a slow-growing vine. Their relationship had been over long before last night. It had just taken her confession, and his own cold invention of Emily, to make it clear. By the time the barbecue wound down and his friends began to leave, Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. He stood by the grill, the coals now reduced to a faint glow, and looked up at the stars. The night was quiet again, but it no longer felt heavy. He didn't know what the future held or how long it would take for him to fully move on. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own life again. And that, he realized, was enough.